evening. A beautiful crowd. And again, I know you've heard it before, but welcome to Baltimore. This is the home to the headquarters of the NAACP. And actually, this town, my father went to jail 26 years ago, no, 1966, a long time ago. In 1966, desegregating this downtown so that conventions like this could be held here, people of all races, of all identities, enjoying being together and not separated by silly laws. You know, I'm really grateful for Ray's leadership. Ray's a good friend. She's a courageous leader. You know, my father taught me a long time ago, and I should say he was the one white guy in jail that day desegregating this downtown, the convention center, that week, actually. Told me a long time ago, he said, son, you know, it's okay to be afraid. We all get afraid sometimes. The question is, what do you do with that fear? If you act in spite of that fear, you are a hero. If you act because of that fear, you are a coward. Ray is a hero, and I'm grateful for her leadership in Washington. As you've heard, the struggle for lesbian, bisexual, gay, transgender equality is near and dear to my heart. My brother Jason, whom I was raised, faced discrimination at a very early age because of his transgender identity. It didn't strike us as odd. He had been dressing in dresses and wearing wigs and singing Diana Ross since he was 2. But as I'll talk about, some other folks didn't quite see it the same way. I stand before you today as an individual deeply vested in this struggle, but also as the leader of an organization with strong connections to the fight for LGBT rights. Past few years, the association has experienced a renaissance. Membership is up 3 years in a row, first time in over 20 years. And as we have expanded our membership and our staff and our programs, including a major focus in ensuring that HIV does not become the forgotten epidemic in this country, we have also sought to more fully embrace the diversity within our own ranks. Recently, the Jackson State chapter of the NAACP, a chapter I helped organize when Governor Fordyce tried to turn a college into a prison, chose a 30-year-old white man to be the head of their chapter, both a non-traditional student and a non-traditional Jackson State student in many ways. Our chapter in New Jersey, down near Atlantic City, chose a Honduran immigrant to be their leader. And in Worcester, Massachusetts, my father went to college. The branch in Worcester, which had been dormant for 5 years, has been revitalized by a new president who's a 28-year-old black gay professor. Tomorrow's NAACP leaders won't just be inspired by the words of Dr. King or the deeds of W.B. Du Bois or Ida B. Wells, or the ongoing fight to end over-incarceration, but, yeah, whoo, I'll take that. 7 million prisoners on Earth, 2 million in the United States. Either we must believe that our neighbors are that much more evil than everybody else on Earth, or we're doing something very, very wrong in this country. But not only will they be inspired by that work, they'll be inspired by our ongoing work in places like Alabama to defend the rights of immigrants. Our work to champion and tolerance and push back against religious intolerance across this country, and our work to ensure that the LGBT community is not discriminated against in employment or in any other aspect of their life. As a leading employer in the nonprofit sector in the state of Maryland, we will be there in Annapolis to make sure that the gender identity anti-discrimination bill is passed. It is consistent with the advocacy we've already done to push Congress to finally pass the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And we ask that all of you who live here in Maryland or are willing to come back to Maryland, help us abolish the death penalty and do right by the memory of Troy Davis. But this striving for inclusion is not new. The NAACP, the task force, and many other LGBT leadership organizations across this country have fought together since before the days when Bayard Rustin planned the March on Washington in 1963. On a personal note, I will never forget meeting Bayard's partner. Talk about a courageous guy. He said, you know, Ben, when I went home to tell my mom about my new boyfriend, I wasn't quite sure what scared me more, having to tell her that he was black, that I was gay, or that he was as old as she was. He's a good man, and he continues to push to make sure that people don't forget Bayard. And frankly, all of us in the progressive movement would be right to study him. I've been told that for an entire wing of the Tea Party, he is their favorite author. So if the Tea Party's learning from Bayard Rustin, we should make sure that we're learning from him too. But he was a black gay hero who literally wrote the textbook for mobilizing the masses to Washington for jobs and freedom. And it was very consciously in the spirit of Bayard Rustin that we planned One Nation Working Together intentionally to be the most inclusive and affirming march for jobs that our nation's capital has ever seen. If Bayard came back, we wanted him to come back and see something that was more welcoming to him than even his march was. The coalition that we put together has been effective, not in spite of its diversity, but because of the diversity of the groups involved. Last year, the NAACP went deeper internally. We actually had our first NAACP town hall meeting at a national convention on LGBT issues, led by our former chairman, Julian Bond. But this is about the work, and as somebody whose parents once had to drive from a church in Washington, D.C., all the way back to their home in Baltimore to celebrate their wedding because their marriage was illegal here, and this is a point of personal privilege. Somebody who had to grow up with the hatred that people felt empowered to cast on us as a family, because they knew that my parents' marriage until very recently had been illegal. I'm very proud of the leadership of the Baltimore branch in standing up for marriage equality. Just as the California NAACP fought Prop 8, just as William Barber, president of the North Carolina NAACP called me today and said, make sure that that crowd knows that we are doing everything we can to stop that silly amendment from becoming law. Tonight I want to share with you my own personal story about making a choice at a very young age that the best antidote to hatred is unity. I was born in the village of Carmel, California, a community that's, hey, all right, 831 in the house. How you doing? All right. Y'all got to understand, that place is 1 mile square, so that's a pretty special experience right there. There was only one other black boy in town that we knew of who was my age. We sort of lived in the hood of Carmel because he lived right across the street. That was the black neighborhood. Our house, his house. And as it turned out, his mom was my mom's best friend. Our older sisters were each other's best friends. And from the age of 6 months, he was my best friend. We got so used to, by the time we were 4, people asking us if we were brothers, we just looked at each other and said, yeah, we're brothers. And that's the only word we've ever used to describe each other ever since. And it made more and more sense as his family moved in with our family, and his mom, even after I moved off to college, moved back in for 10 years with my parents. His sister and his nephew lived with me in my house the last 3 years. I raised his nephew as my nephew because we are brothers and I am his uncle too. And our first fight was very clearly our fight. We were the 2 black boys in town. And even when we moved 2 towns over, the manager of the Five and Dime would chaperone us to every aisle of the store. As our white friends ran around willy-nilly and they would just stare at us like, what did you do wrong to deserve that? And then just keep on running. And we knew why we were being chaperoned, because we were black and we were different. But a few years later, for our peers, it became a much bigger deal that Jason would occasionally wear a wig outside the house, or wear makeup outside the house, or come to the door in a dress. And some of those friends who had actually stood with us, white kids, fighting out white bullies who were picking on the black kids, made it very clear to me that maybe this time I should let those kids' hatred be Jason's issue and not seek to fight this one too. And I sat there in that moment, and I had to make a very quick decision because the fight was about to start. And I decided that, quite frankly, whether you say that you don't like us because we ain't like you are, or you don't like us because I hang out with him and he ain't like us, if you pick a fight with a brother, if you pick a fight with my brother, you pick a fight with me. These are the very human realities and bonds that pundits ignore when they seek to stereotype the black community, black leadership, or even black clergy. This is why I'm so proud that the NAACP bought ads, organized masses of activists to make sure that the Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Hate Crime Act became law. Oppression is oppression is oppression, and hatred is hatred is hatred. And because of that law, now all hate crimes are protected, regardless of where they occur or whom is targeted. And let me say, as I was coming here tonight, I was thinking about James Byrd, I was thinking about Matthew Shepard, I was thinking about James Anderson. And you know how the press really wanted to get into, well, did they go after James Anderson because he was black, or did they go after James Anderson because he was gay? brother's been addicted to drugs, and he's in and out of SROs in the Tenderloin. And when the police beat him up, he's never quite sure if they're picking on him because he lives in an SRO, or they're picking on him because he's black, or they're picking on him because he's gay, or maybe it's all of the above. Hatred is hatred is hatred. Hate violence is wrong no matter where it happens. And I really don't care whether they went after a man because he was black, or because he was gay, or because he was black and gay, or because they just thought he was just simply black. I don't care. And thank all of you for standing up to get that bill through. But you know, quite frankly, what's even more of a threat to our own success than the media's failure to recognize our common struggles, it's often our own failure to come together on issues of common interest. We at the NAACP believe that America moves closer to truly being America when we expand access to quality education for all, when we expand access to financial opportunity for all, and when we expand access to the ballot box and political power for all. As Frederick Douglass observed in a speech against the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1860s or early 1870s, speech entitled Our Composite Nationality, and this is a paraphrase. He was a little bit more flurried than I am. Every nation has a destiny which is defined by that nation's character, and every nation's character tends to be defined by that nation's geography. And our nation's geography is unique because it is bordered by two nations and surrounded by two oceans. And he said, our destiny as a nation defined by that geography is to be the most perfect example of human unity that the world has ever seen. That is what we in the civil rights community, what the task force and the NAACP do. We empower America to be America. We empower America to be truly the most perfect example of human unity the world has ever seen. That must be our goal. And that is why whether a child is bullied by another student because of her sexual orientation or gender identity, or a child is mistreated by a principal or teacher because of his race. Point here, Texas, last year, a study was completed. They looked at 1 million children's school discipline records, found no factor more determinative of whether or how a child will be punished by their school than their race. That regardless of whether that child is being bullied because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, or being targeted for unfair suspension because of their race, the task force and the NAACP must stand up together, because a child who's being bullied or discriminated against in their school does not have fair access to quality education. That is why, whether fighting to end discrimination against LGBT people at work or black folks at the bank, the NAACP and the task force must be strong together, because when you or your community is the target of any ism in the marketplace, ending discrimination is as important as job creation, and ending the virus of hatred anywhere requires stamping it out everywhere. And that is why in this moment, when our nation is in the midst of the greatest wave of voter suppression legislation that our nation has seen since literally before the creation of the NAACP, the greatest wave of voter suppression legislation that our nation has experienced since before the creation of the NAACP. You literally have to go back to the 1890s to find a year when we excluded more people from the voting process with new laws than we have done in the past year. In this moment, we have to stand together. We have to recognize our common interests in an expanded electorate that looks more like the future than like the past. In 2011 alone, more than 30 states across the country introduced legislation to suppress the vote. It comes in the form of strict photo ID bills. Bills that are so strict that a black grandmother in Missouri who has voted pretty much all of her adult life in Missouri no longer can vote because now she has to have an ID that requires her to have her birth certificate, her original birth certificate, not a duplicate. And having lost hers somewhere across the last 8 decades, she went back to the courthouse in her home county in Mississippi and found out that not too long after she was born, it had burned down and her birth certificate had been destroyed with it. But the law is so stringent with no exceptions, she literally has been blocked from voting. Amen. But then behind the voter ID laws come the registration ID laws. These laws say that we will not even process your voter registration form unless a Xerox of your driver's license or your passport is attached. By July of last year, already 40,000 voter registration forms have been literally, essentially put in the trash in the state of Arizona alone because people's IDs weren't attached. Now, raise your hand if you've ever participated in a voter registration drive. All right. It's a lot of folks. Keep them up, keep them up, keep them up. Now, please keep them up if you've ever done that while pushing a Xerox machine down the street. That's the point. They want to make it hard for us to sign up folks to vote. Florida came to their senses a little bit after Bush v. Gore. You know, Jeb Bush and Charlie Crist teamed up and they looked at the whole issue of excluding formerly incarcerated people from voting, and they decided not to do it anymore. And then, you know, some conservatives were all right with that, but some other conservatives, there's a lot of libertarians, for instance, who are very good on this issue, but some other conservatives were a bit peeved that the next major presidential election that came through, somebody in a different party won that state. And so what did the next Republican governor do? He got rid of the executive order, and this year there will be 500,000 Floridians who were able to vote in 2008 who won't be able to vote this year simply because they have resurrected an ex-felon voting ban. Bans so undeniably racist that you can literally go back to the legislative history from when they were first introduced in states that range from New York to Virginia to Mississippi and find statements like this one from the 1906 Virginia Constitutional Convention. It's a rough paraphrase, but maybe 3 words are wrong, where they said, the word darky here, though, is absolutely from that, a direct quote. When embedding their law into their Constitution, where it still stands, one of the worst ex-felon bans in the country, bans you for life, because of this plan, the darky will be eliminated as a factor in this state's politics in the next 5 years. Well, when that's what's in the legislative history from the 19th century, and you're governor in the 21st century, what about that makes you think it's a good idea? Unless that's exactly what you want to do. Now, on top of all that, I mean, we literally have states in a tizzy trying to pass voter ID laws. They're saying that people are impersonating other people at the polls, and we've got to stop it. The Republican Lawyers Association was so thoroughly worried about this issue that they went and they looked for every single voter fraud case they could find in the last 15 years. They found 352 cases in the entire country spread across 15 years. All right, I don't know, do the math up here. Maybe it's 25 cases a year. It is a small fraction of the number of reports that we get for UFO sightings coming into the federal government every year. And not only can prosecutors totally handle this crushing caseload of 30 cases spread across the country every year, but based on that logic that we need all these new laws to protect against something that generates about 30 complaints, given that there's about 300 complaints a year for UFOs, we should be trying to resurrect Orson Welles and prepare to fight the War of the Worlds. Let me be clear, this attack, these so-called voter ID and registration ID bills may not be, in fact, are not a rational response to voter fraud. That would be just called prosecution. But it is fueled by a very rational, if misguided interest. Those who are seeking to block the vote are absolutely responding to the growing diversity of the American electorate. An electorate that is increasingly more tolerant and less interested in the issues that divide us as a nation. And they are attacking voters of color, attacking students of all colors, the groups that are most, seniors are also impacted, like that grandmother I talked about, but these are the groups that are most severely impacted, exactly because those voters' entrance into our society holds the best promise for accelerating us towards the future. This is a pattern we have seen every time in the history of this country that the electorate has expanded in a significant way. The electorate expanded because of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And then what happened? 40 years of attacks seeking to narrow the vote. The state of New York, a little fascinating tidbit of history, actually opposed the 15th Amendment. They had already given black property owners the right to vote before the Civil War, and they simply didn't want their politics to be changed by all blacks voting. And so when they pushed through one of the first ex-felon bans to be passed in the wake of the Civil War, they said that they were doing explicitly to achieve a similar counterbalancing of the black vote, a similar suppression of the black vote. To the Civil Rights Movement, we saw an expansion in the electorate. And we saw the rise of the Southern strategy, and with it, very nasty forms of illegal but very effective voter suppression. And now, following 2008, following the most diverse in every way presidential electorate in history, what do we see? But the resurrection of these old viruses, of these old tactics, of these old playbooks. And we must come together to stamp them out at all costs. You know, and that's why I love Ray so much, because we were talking, and I said, Ray, we really need your help. And she said, don't worry, I'm already making plans on how to get this done. We need leaders like that, leaders of vision, leaders of courage, leaders who understand that the only way that any of us is going to win if we all dive in and do it together. We've already had a major victory. South Carolina DOJ has just rejected their voter ID bill. And while Nikki Haley is headed to the Supreme Court trying to get that bill reinstated and possibly gut the Voting Rights Act at the same time, we are cautiously optimistic she will not find the fifth vote that she needs. Nonetheless, we must remain vigilant and focused. Dr. King said that voting is the foundation stone for political action. We must do all we can to protect the right to vote, because people come after your right to vote, quite frankly, to make it easier to go after so many other rights that you may in fact hold more dear. Let me be clear, the folks who are funding this attack on voting rights are the same folks who are funding attacks on environmental protection. They're the same folks who are funding attacks on immigrants' rights. They are the same folks who are funding attacks on a woman's right to choose. They are the same folks who are peeved about affirmative action and would really like to not see something like this gender identity anti-discrimination bill passed. They are, in other words, a little upset that today's America looks more like something approaching a more perfect example of human unity than the world that they were born into a long, long time ago. But with the task force and the NAACP and so many other sister and brother organizations and the progressive movement coming together, very clear that we can never allow ourselves to be discouraged, distracted, or divided with something as critical as the vote, our children's lives, or our community's financial strength at stake. We are on a good path, and we have to stay on this path because history has taught us that we can never win the battle for justice, equality, and freedom when our soldiers are defined and limited by individual silos. That we can only emerge victorious when we unite for the common good for all. We emerge victorious when we build large, diverse coalitions who dare to dream bold dreams and then do the hard work to turn bold dreams into big victories. So let us move forward in unity with the collective vision and determination required to build the America that we dream of for all her children. An America where everyone can get a good job. An America where everyone can obtain a quality education. An America where everyone has access to health care and communities with clean air and clean water, and stay with their loved one at the hospital. An America in which opportunities are afforded to all, and most importantly, an America in which no matter a person's race, creed, sexual orientation, or gender, she or he can live in a country free of discrimination, hatred, and violence. A nation where all of our basic human rights, basic dignities are respected. As I close and prepare to take my seat, let us all recall the words of the late, great California statesman and visionary Harvey Milk. It takes no compromising to give people their rights. It takes no money to respect the individual. It takes no survey to remove repression. Thank you, Task Force, for being the task force that we at the NAACP depend on you to be, and you can depend on me to make sure that the NAACP is there for you. Thank you, and God bless.